All right, well, let's take another look at activity-based costing. In this segment, we're going to look at how there's some other uses for activity-based costing. Now, before we begin, remember there are 4 steps when you use ABC. First, you identify your cost pools. Second, identify the cost driver for each cost pool. Third, you calculate an activity rate for each of the cost pools. And fourth, you allocate costs to the cost objects. So this works very much like a traditional costing system, but rather than lumping all of the overhead costs together, we will isolate them and try to allocate them based on the activity that actually causes that particular cost to be incurred. Now, a cost object can be anything that management desires cost data to be collected on. So we've already studied how ABC can be used for a product line or an individual product, but it can also be used to track and trace costs to a customer or a customer type, such as at a bank you might have student accounts and you may have commercial accounts, and you want to know what the costs are associated with servicing each of those groups. Or it could be a supplier. So first we'll look at the ABC to determine the cost of serving customers, and what we're trying to focus on here is when you have a certain type of customer, there may be costs associated with that. For example, customer support. So if I call in and maybe I get an Apple product, an iPod or iPad or iPhone, and I need support, there may be customer groups that they would want to allocate that cost to. Sales calls, any of your travel expenses, telephone expenses, entertainment and dining, those kinds of things. You may be able to trace it directly to a customer, or there may be just a general cost of sending out your sales force. And in that case, you would want to allocate the cost of those sales calls. Evaluating credit. So if you're selling on account, then some time is going to have to be spent if you want to extend credit. Now, it can also be used to trace costs to suppliers. So let's think about why a supplier would cost money other than what you pay to buy, say, the part. Maybe you buy some kind of processor from a supplier, and of course you're going to pay the cost of that part, but what kinds of things can cost additional money are when you're sent defective parts. Because if your supplier sends you defective parts, you may have to rework inventory, redesign it, or install that part with a good one. You'll have to reorder. You might have some warranty work if you've already sold that inventory to your customer, and you might have expedited shipping because the production took too long given the failed parts. So reordering costs, expedited shipping caused by failed parts, and warranty work. So we want to find a way to allocate these costs to the suppliers to find the total cost of actually dealing with that supplier. Now, if you'll turn to the end of your notes, you will find an example that relates to customer-related costs. Let's read through it. Buggy Sports International manufactures tires for dune buggies and has 2 primary types of customers: small beach shops and a large retailer. The small beach shops normally order 2,000 units each year, while the large retailer orders 6,000 units each year. So we can see from this that your large retailer does a lot of volume with your company. The company uses an activity-based costing system to assign customer costs to its 2 customer types. The company has collected the following data. So what we know is that the manufacturing cost associated with the inventory sold to the small shops is $100,000. The manufacturing cost of the inventory sold to the large retailer is $300,000. Those costs are directly traceable to each of those customer types. We can see that the small shops, while they order 2,000 parts, they place 90 orders to do it, while the large retailer buys 6,000 and only places 10 orders. The small shops require 12 sales calls, maybe one per month, whereas the large retailer requires 3. Order processing expects to incur $10,000 in cost next year, and sales force costs are expected to be $60,000 next year. We're going to do 3 things: calculate the activity rate for each customer-related cost, calculate the total cost assigned to each customer type, and calculate the cost per unit for each customer type. So you do need to identify first, what activity rates are we talking about? Well, there are 2 customer-related costs that need to be allocated. First, the order processing costs, and second, the sales force costs. We will find their activity rate by taking the total cost, which for order processing is $10,000. And you can refer back to the information given, and that order processing cost would be allocated based on the number of orders placed, which I have 100 orders there. That is 90 for the small shops and 10 for the large retailer, for a total of 100 orders. So what we're assuming here is that orders cause order processing to incur costs, which is a logical assumption. In any event, order processing costs are $100 per order. Sales force costs, on the other hand, are $60,000 in total, and we can see that a total of 15 sales calls will be made during the year, 12 for the small shops and 3 for the large retailer. That computes to $4,000 per sales call. So that includes travel expenses and entertainment and so on and so forth. Now that we have those activity rates, we can find the total cost assigned to each customer type. So remember, the 2 customer types are small retailers and the large retailer. So we have small beach shops and 1 large retailer. The costs associated with each of these, first we'll look at the manufacturing costs. These are directly traceable. This is the cost of the inventory that we're actually selling to these customer types, given as $100,000 for the small beach shops and $300,000 for the large retailer. Then to allocate out the order processing cost, we will use our rate of $100 per order, and for the small shops, 90 orders will be processed, so $9,000 will be assigned to the small retailer or small retailers. Whereas the large retailer, $100 times 10 orders, or $1,000. So when you look at this, recall that order processing cost is expected to be $10,000, and we have allocated it to the customer types based on consumption of resources. Which of these customers consumes more resources? And it's the small retailers, because they place a lot of smaller orders, whereas clearly the large retailer orders less often with larger orders. Sales calls are allocated at a rate of 4,000 per sales call. 12 will be expected to be required from the small shops, and only 3 to the large retailer. So the $60,000 of cost expected for sales calls is allocated $48,000 to the small shops, $12,000 to the large retailer. So now we can see that the total cost of serving the small shops is $157,000 and the large retailer is $313,000. Now, because the large retailer orders 3 times as many units as the small shops, it would be a good idea to make the calculation that we're told to do in question 3, and that is calculate the cost per unit for each customer type. This would include the direct costs and the allocated costs. So we can begin for each of those customer types with the total cost. So you could just continue from here to calculate this. We have found that the small shops, the cost is $157,000, whereas the large retailers, $313,000. In the first paragraph of information, we were told small beach shops normally order 2,000 units each year, while the large retailer orders 6,000 units each year. So I'm going to divide these total costs by the number of units for each of these customer types. And what we find is that the cost per unit for the small retailers is $78.50 and the large is $52.17. So clearly, for the same inventory, it costs less to service those large companies. Now, the way this information can be used, obviously there's a variety of ways. You could say, gosh, we're going to emphasize the large retailer because it's so much cheaper to deal with them since they don't order as often and they don't expect as many sales visits. But a lot of companies just realize that they need to hang on to those small customers. But this will help them set their price points for various order sizes and that sort of thing. So it's still very useful information, even if you don't just emphasize the type of company that costs you less to deal with. All right, now that's all of our coverage for activity-based costing. So review these concepts, work on your homework, and bring some questions to class. See you then.